Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event, Women on Boards, Time to Level Up. This is a joint event by the European Parliament Liaison Office in Ireland and the European Commission's representation in Ireland. Happy International Women's Day to everybody. It's a day when we're supposed to come together to celebrate the social, economic, cultural, political achievements of women, to lobby for gender equality. So it's an apposite day to be discussing this topic. We've come a long way, but we haven't yet got the equality of representation for half of the Irish or the world's or the EU's population in leadership and politics. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. We've got 5 speakers, so we're a bit pressed for time. We'll have just over 20 minutes at the end for questions. Get your questions into the chat function, start now. You can also follow our event online. Our social media hashtags are EU4Women, that's the number 4, and IWD 2022. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce Barbara Nolan, the head of the European Commission's representation here in Ireland. Barbara has spent most of her career at the Commission in Brussels, where she's been working in management positions in areas including employment, fundamental rights and education. So there's no better woman or no better person to take us through where things stand now with the European Commission's proposal for women on boards. Barbara.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm delighted to kick off this Women's Day event to focus on an important issue, which is the underrepresentation of women in corporate decision-making. I think this can no longer be explained by a lack of skilled women with ambition to lead. Today, women outnumber men in educational attainment and are willing to take on leadership responsibilities. The imbalance of decision-making power means that women are often not part of shaping the decisions that affect our society and our businesses. Currently, only 30% of board members of the largest publicly listed companies in the EU member states are women, and less than 1 in 10 board presidents or CEOs are women. And one big barrier we found is the lack of transparency in selection procedures and qualification criteria for board positions. Board appointments are often made in a very opaque way, making it more difficult for women with necessary qualifications to apply for such positions. For example, old boys networks and such like are very exclusionary of women. And this can, of course, negatively affect not only the careers of potential candidates, but in the longer term, of course, investors' business decisions. So there's a clear business case, and I'm sure some of the other panelists will speak about that. So 10 years ago, the Commission proposed a directive to address the issue of gender balance on boards, with a minimum target of 40% of the underrepresented sex. The proposal does not impose binding gender quotas on listed companies, nor does it give automatic preference to women or men. Rather, it aims to ensure a transparent selection process for board members, and it guarantees that qualifications and merit remain the key criteria to join the board. You may ask, why did we not go for mandatory quotas? Well, we wanted to give member states the possibility to choose their own preferred approach to reach the 40% target. This, of course, does not exclude quotas. Indeed, 8 member states already have quotas, but we wanted to make progress with this issue and to get the proposal adopted, and this requires a qualified majority. So the directive would create basically a floor below which standards would not fall, but nothing, of course, stops any individual member state going for a much more robust or, mandatory quotas way to reach this target. For small and medium-sized enterprises, they are exempt from the directive. It doesn't apply to firms with fewer than 250 employees or to unlisted companies. So basically, it aims to break the glass ceiling and ensure that the largest listed companies make full use of the available talent pool. Without legislation at European level, gender balance in corporate boards, we believe, will remain slow and uneven across member states. National voluntary measures that have existed up to now in some member states are very welcome, but they have not resulted in the rapid change that we need to see if we really want to reach a target of 40% and to make a difference. And just to give you a snapshot of the picture across Europe, 8 member states have introduced mandatory quotas. France, which has mandatory quotas, is the only EU country to have at least 40% of each gender on the boards of the largest companies, with women holding 45% of all positions. In 10 member states with softer measures, and that includes Ireland, the figure was around 31%. And in the 9 member states where no action or no significant action has been taken, it was around 16%. So, we see that it's very uneven around Europe. So I've kept the good news for last, which is this proposal, which has languished on the table of the Council of Ministers, the member states, finally looks like it will be soon adopted. President von der Leyen has thrown her weight behind it. Frances Fitzgerald, who will speak to you shortly, has been at the forefront of the European Parliament's cross-party support to the proposal. Now we have seen with the new German government that they have shifted position to support the proposal, and this will give us the qualified majority we need to get the proposal adopted. So the future looks bright. This will break the deadlock, and I'll conclude by just saying we are ready to move forward. We were very hopeful that it will be adopted soon. As I said, even after 10 years, it's absolutely, the progress is going to happen finally. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Barbara. Next up, we have Frances Fitzgerald MEP. She was elected an MEP in 2019, an MEP for Dublin. She is also Vice President of the EPP Group, a member of and EPP spokesperson at the Parliament's Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee. She's also a member of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Frances has been a Fine Gael TD for 20 years, one of only 4 female Taoiseach. She's also been Minister for Business, Minister for Justice, and was the first ever Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, and is a former chair of the National Women's Council of Ireland and Vice President of the European Women's Lobby. Frances Fitzgerald, we heard from Barbara that there's optimism now that this proposal will get adopted. We have a council coming up next week, and then we may go into negotiations with the Parliament. Can you take us through the main tenets of the proposal, why it's important to get it done now, and why you think it hasn't gotten through for the last decade?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I suppose let me say, first of all, that everything today is overshadowed by the dreadful war in Ukraine, what's happening to Ukrainian women and men. And we've been just hearing about women giving birth and being helped by doctors online, and babies getting sepsis in the first few days. So that's what's happening in part of Europe today. So I think I couldn't speak today without commenting on the Ukrainian situation. But thank you for the invitation to speak today. And thank you, Sarah. And Barbara has given a very good introduction there of where we're at. There will be a meeting on Monday of the Council of Ministers, the Social Affairs Ministers. The directive has been delayed by 10 years. I reread it yesterday, and effectively the hope then, can you believe it, 10 years ago, was that we would have reached the 40% target by 2020. We're now in 2022. Barbara has given you the figures. The differentials across Europe vary from 8% to France being the best. I think it's, France? It's very high anyway. It's the top and has done very well, but of course with mandatory quotas. Very clear that the countries that have mandatory quotas have a faster rate of change. It's expected that the countries that have mandatory quotas will reach parity in 4 years, and those with softer measures, we're expecting it will take about 13 years. You asked the question, why has it been delayed? What a very good question. Extraordinary that Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands all put a veto on it effectively. Ursula von der Leyen, to her credit, has now ensured that this will go through, I expect, barring big surprises, on Monday, and it will then enter into trialogues where the final detail will be worked out. I think Ursula would like to stick pretty close to the original directive. She wants to get it done. She thinks it's important, symbolically. I had a meeting with her. She's very close, I think, to getting agreement right across our member states. That's really important. Why has it been resisted? I think partly subsidiarity, partly people saying you don't interfere with business. You know, business will get on and do what it wants to do. Business has originally expressed a lot of reservations. I think that's changed. I think the best businesses are now ahead of the posse when it comes to involving women. So just because gender equality as well isn't as high a priority as it needs to be, despite being at the centre of European values, as I was saying in the Parliament this morning, speaking on Ukraine. So we're in a good place in terms of moving this forward. And then it is up to the will of the member states. Mandatory measures, legislation, a good push seem to be important, but I know we've had some success in Ireland with less than mandatory measures. So I think we need all of the initiatives we can find in this area. I'm going to make a few points in the short time available to me. First of all, I think my own view is that we need to look at equality increasingly through an economic lens. We need to look at the loss to our GDP by not having equality, including in terms of representation and leadership within companies, on boards, and in fact, everywhere. We need women, as we know, in all of the decision-making fora, and we have far too few. The critical mass, 30% is a minimum, and really 50% would be gender equity. So that's what we're aiming for. Now, the statistics are extraordinary. Christine Lagarde has done super work on this when she was heading up the IMF in terms of the difference to our GDP. If I say to you that improving gender equality by 2050 in Europe would boost EU GDP by between 1.95 trillion and 3.15 trillion, isn't that extraordinary? What country would not want to do this? Yet we're surprisingly slow when it comes to, women in STEM and the broader equality issues, not to mind diversity on boards, which from a consumer point of view, from a representational point of view, from a competition and from an innovation point of view is really important, as well as much improved performance. We have all of the statistics to show that. As I said, the better companies know that, but it needs the push from policymakers, from politicians, from member states, and indeed from Europe. If we look at the potential of including more women in STEM, digital and AI, that's a 16 billion annual boost to EU GDP. Now, what we give for an extra number of billions like that in our economy at present to do all of the tasks that we need to do. So I think that the economic arguments are incredibly strong. Let's look at that economic lens. Let's promote it. Let's make sure that people understand it. The statistics about, companies as well are very good. You put one more woman on a board of 8, and it's interesting, the performances improve all around. So I think diversity, we're very clear, is good for economic development. That was not understood as clearly, I think, 10 years ago as it is today. So I think it's an imperative. It's clear that having an EU directive being implemented at member states will make a substantial difference, as it's modelling exactly what we need to do in terms of getting there. We have the education of women has taken a quantum leap forward. We have people in every area, although there's some worrying statistics about women in ICT and AI and STEM, that the numbers are going down. So we need increased emphasis on that. If we're to deal with the 39% pension gap as well, we need to be making sure women are getting those jobs. I would just say at a personal level, having been in cabinet with 2 women, and then with 3, 4 and 5, it's quite clear to me that we have different types of conversations, and the research from Sweden proves it. When you have women and men working together, you get different topics discussed. You can get stereotyped in a stereotype way. People would say you get more social issues discussed, you get childcare, but it's true. You do get those balances, the socio-economic balances, I think, seem to me, at a personal level, I've seen this to be better represented when you have women and men working together and you have a diverse population to work with. So I would say that it's a no-brainer from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, from an equal opportunities and gender equality point of view, to move in this direction. The stats are there. Nowhere is it that high. And if we do it, we get higher returns both for the firms and for the member states. So I think it is great that we have finally got to it. I regret it's taken so long. I really want to congratulate all of those individuals who've done so much in Ireland to highlight this. And I remember being on the second commission on the status of women, and there was such a low percentage, and we at that stage said, let's set a target. And once you push the social partners and government, you do begin, even with a target, you do begin to see the results. And we have to monitor at a government level as well. You need to monitor this on an ongoing basis, on a yearly basis, need to publish. And I think we'll be hearing more of that from the other contributors here today, that how getting companies involved and, publishing the results and encouraging people to be active in this area does make a difference. And I think there's a lot of potential here to really shift things in the next 5 years. Thanks very much again for the invitation to be part of this session today.
Thanks, Frances. Next up, to talk through that company side of things, we have Aongus Hegarty, who's President of International Markets for Dell Technologies and also co-chair of the industry-led Balance for Better Business initiative. He has spent over 3 decades in the technology industry. He's on the Economist Global Diversity list, on one of the top 10 diversity champions on that list. He was appointed co-chair of the Balance for Better Business initiative last year. Its aim is to help increase participation by women on boards in listed and private companies. He also co-leads Dell's Women's Network and is a member of the Global Diversity Council, which is chaired by Michael Dell. Aongus Hegarty, Frances mentioned that there was this culture of not interfering with business over the last 10 years, and maybe that's why this initiative hasn't taken off. Are these kinds of legislative initiatives welcomed by business? And maybe you might talk us through as well those statistics that Frances Fitzgerald mentioned about the decreasing numbers of women in AI and IT and STEM.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to join the panel this afternoon, and thank you again, Frances, for the invitation. Sarah, as you mentioned, I'm co-chair of the Balance for Better Business group, and as you said, it's an independent business-led review group established by the government just over 3 years ago. We monitor the progress of gender balance within the highest levels of business and have set out actions for organizations to take to increase the percentage of women on both corporate boards and on senior management positions as well too. With my co-chair, Julie Simon, our goal is to build on the progress achieved to date by accelerating cultural change within the business community and to unlock many of the benefits that Frances spoke about. I mean, gender balance is not just a metric. A more inclusive leadership team and board can build a foundation and a culture that really enables, as Frances mentioned, a lot more innovation, better performances within the business, stronger governance, and far more creativity as well too. Since the Balance for Better Business was established in 2018, we have seen some good progress. The percentage of women on boards of ISAC 20 companies has risen from 18 to now 32 at the beginning of this year. For other listed companies, the percentage of women on boards is at 20%, hitting the target that was set for 2021, and it has doubled since 2018. Of the ISAC 20 companies have exceeded their 2021 target for female representation on senior leadership roles. However, other listed companies and large Irish-owned private companies have missed the targets for 2021. The focus and emphasis on senior leadership diversity is absolutely critical. So even though we're seeing a picture that's improving, the overall representation in this group, senior leadership, is unquestionably far too low. A more intense focus is required in organizations to build a strong internal pipeline of women from the junior levels of the organization right up into taking those leadership team positions. If you look at the representation of CEOs and CFOs, it's remained relatively static. businesses need to pay attention not only to the internal progression, but also to the types of role that the women are progressing into. We want to see more women in these key decision and leadership positions. It's an absolute, as Frances said, and a key business priority. I think targets have the potential for longer term sustainable improvements, and we should continue to encourage women boards to continue and increase the share of representation on those boards. However, targets are only one piece of the puzzle. Cultural change is absolutely key to achieve a greater gender balance at all levels. And that's why it's one of the key priorities for us within Balance for Better Business. So I would strongly encourage businesses, and we've identified 3 key things businesses should focus on to drive that diversity within their organizations, within their leadership teams, and on their boards to unlock the benefits that we've been talking about here this afternoon. First of all, put in place an action plan. It's like any other business objective, make gender balance a key business objective and build an action plan around that. Secondly, build a gender balanced succession plan, both for the board and the executive leadership teams. You need a robust pipeline of future leaders coming through that has gender diversity and balance on those succession plans, on those slates. And report on the progress. This is really critical. I'd say to all companies on a quarterly basis, review progress against that action plan. Review progress against the succession plans that you've built. This will allow for transparency and clear accountability to deliver on the targets and goals that you're setting out. I think by taking these actions, leaders should begin to think differently, look at diversity from all perspectives, experiences, and skill sets. And this will help to drive an inclusive innovation and innovative environment going forward. I would say when I think about innovation, I recall, many years ago hearing the story of the company that was developing an application that would support companies in uploading videos to the internet. Great success, launched the program, massive uptake. They then looked at the quality of the videos and realized that about 10% of them were actually uploading incorrectly. And when they went back through all their testing and analysis, what they discovered is they had an issue with the application when left-hand people held their smartphone and were uploading the video versus right-handed people. And in their development group and in their testing bed, they only had right-handed people. It's a very small point, much broader than gender, but diversity in all aspects and lenses is critical to innovation. As the president of the international markets here at Dell Technologies, I lead a diverse international team. And for me and my team, diversity is an absolute business priority, a business initiative that we absolutely look to differentiate ourselves versus our competition. Over the course of my career, I've listened to many people, met various groups, attended many events like the one here today. And I've tried to take an open mindset and approach, allowing myself to become informed on the topic and allow me to foster a more diverse and leadership team. I remember when I was building my leadership team here in Europe over a decade ago, I had limited diversity from a gender point of view and so focused on that. And one of the first positions I advertised, I was very surprised initially to see a number of my female leaders in the organization not applying for that. I remember particularly talking to Rachel and asking her why was that, and getting a perspective and her perspective around how she thought about that position and applying for that position. 4 out of 5 of the key competencies there, maybe not the 5th one, and realizing that I needed to be far more proactive in mentoring and supporting and working with candidates and that slate and pipeline of talent coming through. Delighted to say that Rachel did get that role and continue to grow and develop her career. Senior leaders need to commit to promoting gender equality and implementing a cultural change in their organization by setting expectations around values and behaviors and holding everyone accountable to operate to those. Achieving gender equality requires honest and rigorous self-assessment. It takes time and it must be on a sustained effort. And by taking a measured approach, we can for sure have an effect and sustain meaningful change. We're all part of that in advocating more diversity and an equitable future. Thank you, and I really look forward to an interesting discussion this afternoon. Back to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aongus. Next up, we have Margaret E Ward, who is the CEO and founder of leadership consultancy Clear Inc. Margaret's a former broadcaster and journalist, having worked for the Irish Times, Sunday Times and News Talk. She is currently on the board of Fáilte Ireland. She's also on the advisory board for several artificial intelligence startups. In the past, she's been on the boards of RTE and the European Movement Ireland. She's also a communications coach for Women for Elections, founder of the Women on Air group, and a former pitch coach for the Cartier Global Women's Initiative. Margaret, maybe you can take us through your experience of being a woman on boards and how you found it getting there in the first place and staying there.
Yeah, so, it's funny. I think that we have a certain idea about who should be on a board, what they look like, how they sound, what their background is. So traditionally on boards, you had accountants, solicitors, and specialists in governance. But I think we need to cast the net a little bit wider. And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. And I hope that everybody listening will maybe think about where and how they look for boards. So I, had been a journalist. I became a campaigner to get more female experts on airwaves, on radio and television. And I founded an organization called Women on Air. And from that point, I was asked by somebody, would I go on the board of European Movement Ireland? And I thought, what do I know, about being on a board? And they said, well, you're running a campaigning organization. You've run your own business for 10 years. You have a business background. Why wouldn't you put yourself forward? So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. And that was a great experience because I was very much mentored by people like Gillian Van Turnhout and Maurice Pratt and many others on that board. From there, then people came and said, well, have you thought about going onto the RTE board? And I said, well, I'm not a member of any political party, so they're not going to look at me. And they're like, what are you talking about? You don't have to be a member of a political party to be on a board. But of course, I'm a foreigner here, right? So you can hear the big, broad American accent. But although I've been here now for 27 years and my parents are Irish, I didn't really understand the power structure or how you get on a board. And they said, there's a great website called stateboards.ie and you can sign up for alerts, which I did. Anyway, so I was hesitant about putting my name forward for the RT board for, thinking they're not going to choose me. Why would I do that? What skills do I have? And then a number of people said, well, why don't you? And I'm like, oh, I don't have the time. And they said, but you really believe in public service broadcasting and journalism. That's been your whole career. I was like, I do, of course. And they said, do you know who's applying for that board? And they would tell me some names of people who I knew really wouldn't be that into press freedom or anything. So I got mad and I threw in my CV, and lo and behold, I got on the board and I was terrified. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. But again, I was guided. And this is the great thing about being on the board is that you are guided. You are given training. You're given support by your fellow board members. You can ask questions. And I have to say, it was an amazing experience full of challenges and insights and, lots of really, really interesting people and situations. Then after that, I decided, I really actually enjoy boards. And I think I do have something to contribute. And then I applied to get on the board of Fáilte Ireland. And I've been serving on that now for nearly 4 years. So I have noticed that some boards now, but they look more outside of just accountancy and solicitors. They look for marketing people. Some have journalism. Some are looking for, say, Irish people who have been living outside of Ireland who work for big multinationals. But I do think we really, really need to talk about throwing the net wider. So, why aren't we looking at entrepreneurs, people who run their own companies, campaigners, people who work in community groups, creative people? Now, a lot of this depends on what your board is, what it does, who its target market is. But we really need to think about people of color, different ethnicities, religions, every different background, travelers. I was just actually talking to somebody today about the rich diversity within that community in terms of art, culture, language, and boards are missing all of that talent. Why would you only look at a tiny percentage of your population for the talent? If somebody's run a business or they've run a voluntary organization. They already know a lot about different markets and marketplaces. We do need to look also at female founders and people from minority groups who run businesses, found groups. Also, greater female membership helps the quality of the male membership. I think it was either Sweden or Denmark who found that once they put more women on boards, it increased the quality of the men who were applying to boards. The other thing, I would agree with everything that Aongus said as well about collecting the data, measuring it, making it public, being transparent. And one big thing is, if you say you're going to take an action and create a female organization, a female network, you need to put some money behind it. Don't just say we're setting up a female network and not put any money behind it, because you're not being sincere in doing that. I think another thing I have seen being on boards is that the subject choices offered in secondary school level in Ireland tend to be quite gender stereotypical, and many young women don't seem to have the same opportunities to study higher level maths or science, which to me shows baked in discrimination, and I think that needs to change. We need to reduce the gender typing of those subjects so that we increase the types of jobs that women can have. Also, we need to be very aware of women's challenges at work. So there was a report, I think, that came out today that said a huge number of women have considered quitting their jobs because although flexible working is super, it's not really helping their burnout rates because they're working from home, great, but they still have other responsibilities. So I think we need to really examine women's lives and think about, if we want more women on boards, what else do we need to think about in terms of flexibility of the meeting time of these boards, childcare provisions, making sure that there's better balance for everybody on that board, male and female. I think also if we're looking at applications for jobs, we need to ask when we do board searches that at least 40% of the candidates that are presented are female and 40% are men. And lastly, I would say, women are not broken. We're not broken. We don't have to change or fix ourselves. We need to fix the structures that make boards a place for men, mainly for white men, and we need to ensure greater diversity, because it doesn't make any sense to waste the talent, intellect, experience, and creativity of half the population. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Just a quick reminder to everybody, get your questions in. We have one more speaker to come, so unless you want me to cannibalize all the questions afterwards, get them in the chat. Next up, we have Nora Casey. She is the CEO of Harmonia, Ireland's largest magazine publisher. She's a broadcaster, entrepreneur, author, and human rights campaigner. You might know her from the TV series Dragon's Den. She's also founder of the Planet Woman Academy. She's on the European board of Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright's Vital Voices. She helped found the London-based Women's Irish Network and is a member of the Government's Forum on a Family-Friendly and Inclusive Parliament. Nora, I know you will have some good ideas maybe to tackle some of the issues that Margaret has brought up. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And firstly, happy International Women's Day, everybody. I feel I'm sitting here for decades and decades doing International Women's Day, but it's really important that we get a chance to talk about these things. A bit like Francis, I think my mind is with Ukraine today, and I was thinking about, why is it so important? Why do we worry so much about women having a seat at the table? And outside of the corporate boardrooms, I think, why is it so important for Ukraine? Because here on the island of Ireland, we know how important it is for women to have a seat at the table, because although war and disasters and crisis, they impact on women and children. You can just see the refugees camps, and there's women on the front line reporting, there's journalists, there's women in politics, but also women are great peacemakers. And here on the island of Ireland, the Northern Ireland National Women's Council in June 1996, I don't know if you remember that, Monica McWilliams and Betty, the first women's party ever to be elected to peace negotiations. So my hope today is that Ukraine gets women a seat at the table for those negotiations, because women are great peace builders and peacemakers, and that's what we need now in terms of the violence and the war there. I also wanted to say that what's different about this year is COVID. It's a really important context for women because I've always said that if you asked me when I was growing up what I wanted to be, I would never have said woman in business. I'd never met one. I didn't see them. They weren't in the news. They weren't in the papers. So what happened to women and visibility during COVID? Well, sadly, for me, it went backwards. So more often than not, in terms of the people in Ireland that we were seeing on the political platforms, in terms of public life, and certainly in terms of the media, and also in terms of business, were overwhelmingly male. That's really important because I think, to go back to that old adage, if you can't see it, you can't be it, but really important for young girls, especially in the middle of a crisis when the whole world and us in our living rooms are focused on the TV, to see a sea of men representing health and politics and public life is not good for our young women in terms of where they see themselves and what they can achieve in the future. More importantly, I think I've seen the emergence of behaviours which I thought were long but gone. So no surprise that in the last year to 18 months, 61% of board appointments in Ireland were men and they were retired. And I'm just going to hazard a guess, they were probably white. So in other words, when the chips are down and people are in crisis, they rely on old boys networks. They bring in the boys they know, usually former executives and former CEOs, to rely on in terms of getting them out of trouble. The other thing that we saw is what we call the She Session in Vital Voices, which is very Washington based, although I'm on the European board. We have some great research coming out of Harvard about issues around women being lost to the workplace. McKinsey itself did a report which showed that 23% of women with children have contemplated or actively considering leaving the workforce. Now, I'm the person who all my life said hybrid working is going to save women in corporate life, but actually what we didn't quantify is that while also working from home, they were providing the main caring responsibility, things that economists never measure and countries never measure and politics doesn't give credence to. So women at home were taking the lion's share of getting the kids to school, making the lunches, homeschooling when that needed to happen, childcare, also throwing the wash in. When I was doing corporate work with women in mentorship positions, that's what they talked about. Mornings that were hellish, getting up early, making the lunches, throwing in the wash, running to do a Zoom call, coming back, getting the kids home from school. So I think that if hybrid working is to work for women, we need to make sure that we take that on board. Then I guess for 100 years, we make March 8th a special day. I often think not special enough. But it also begs the question why women on boards. Frances answered that so eloquently, especially when she referenced Christian Lagarde and all of those great stats about GDP and how much they could contribute to the economy. We know that it's right, ethically, morally, it's right, but it also works. So why is it that we're still sitting here, in 2022, and we have this glacial pace of change? I think that the EU's own gender diversity report showed that it would be 3 generations before we see gender equality. I'm always saying that my great granddaughter in 2080 will be raising a glass of champagne to gender equality. That, fingers crossed, that's the hope. So maybe there is another way. And also, while we are producing miles high of research about why balanced boards make better business sense, where's the research to say that all male boards work? There is none. And yet we still have huge numbers of boards that are all male. And we also have huge numbers that have less than 30%, the magic figure of 30%. So this year, in particular, I felt here in Ireland, it was a year of talking. We had the Citizens' Assembly with Catherine Day, which reported on gender equality. That report came out and it's gone to the Dole. We've yet to hear what's happening since. We also had the National Women's Council produce a report on boards and the future for targets and women on boards. You heard there for Aongus talking about better balance, better business. So they obviously produced their report too. I myself joined a forum that was established by the Ceann Comhairle to look at family-friendly parliament, because the fact that we had a Minister for Justice that got pregnant created a constitutional crisis in Ireland. So we set up a forum and we've now reported 2 months ago. So we've a lot of talking done. So maybe it's time for action. So what's the solution? I spend a lot of my time on the solution bit, by the way, rather than the whinging bit. in my life in business, and certainly when I was doing my PhD, you can look at all kinds of different ways to change people's behavior. We saw lots of that during COVID, by the way. So you can tell them what's right and you can tell them why it's important and how it makes sense. But actually, unless you produce a bit of a stick, in other words, legislation, usually you don't see the level of change that you need to see. In Ireland, we're very short of sticks and of carrots. The reason why the Davis report worked in the UK is that David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, was like a demon about it. He was an ambassador. He went out there and he wrote to them continually and he made sure they met their targets. We don't have that central focus here. We want to achieve it through targets, but we don't have that central ambassadorial high level leadership focus that will drive this through. We don't do any naming or shaming. There are no sanctions. In terms of public funding, even where public bodies are not balanced and not achieving the state's set gender quota, they still get their public funding. So for us, I think we have to decide if we're going to go the target route, we need to put in place some sanctions. We need to have a more robust body that's willing to call out those that are not meeting their targets. We also need to provide some ambassadorial independent leadership position where we can drive this through and make sure people don't lose focus. Since COVID, that's got worse and worse. We also need more diversity. Margaret spoke about that, but when you look at the bodies that are representing us in this space, looking at gender equality, they are woefully inadequate in terms of diversity for both women and men. We can't see the same people all the time cropping up on the same bodies. We do need to have all of the spectrum of women and of men that exist in Ireland to add to that conversation. And also, Ireland is probably the first country. I spent 20 years in the boardrooms of London. I now mentor women all over the world. We have no one central women in business and female founder body, not one. We have loads of different networks, all run by very enthusiastic and brilliant people, but we have no centrally funded, independent, democratic voice for women in business in Ireland, and we need to change that. When it comes to women on boards, finally, they don't get parachuted down. Unfortunately, they do sometimes, but we have to make them. We can't keep relying on an ever decreasing body of women who sit on boards and who follow one board to another. We need to start working on the pipeline. Women, my own focus is always 23 to 33. We lose so many young women who come into banks and other institutions better qualified than the boys, and yet John is more likely to get the elusive corner office in the sky, while Mary is twice as likely to have left. We need to provide high quality mentorship. I firmly believe that mentorship in my lifetime, if somebody says, who is your mentor? I make it up because I never had a mentor. There's no such thing for women of my age to have a mentor. But I do remember conversations usually with a male boss that changed the focus of my career. So if a simple coffee and a short conversation can change my career, I know that high quality mentorship can help young women to progress within organizations. And when you don't believe in yourself or you don't feel you can progress to the next level or go for that job, you need a champion at your side who's going to convince you and speak on your behalf. Lastly, I would say, I know this is controversial. It's great to see Francis and the EU moving forward in terms of targets for women on boards. For me, I wasn't a fan of quotas in the past, but like almost every other woman who has achieved anything in their lives, I am a fan of quotas now because I like the results that they give. And people always say to me, are you not worried, Nora, it might lead to tokenism? I can tell you that when I sit around a boardroom table, I know why I'm there. Because I grew up in an OPW house, went to a Desh school, and I worked so hard in my life to go to university after university. I got all my skills and all my competence, and I sit around that table because I deserve that seat. But as I look around the table, I wonder about some of the men who have the right surname, who are related to the right person, who play golf in the right golf club, who play rugby, or maybe did play rugby, or went to the same school. There's tokenism in Ireland, alive and well, and it's not the women that are guilty of it, I can assure you. I think we've talked long enough in Ireland, and I suspect I have talked long enough as well. Happy International Women's Day, everyone.
Thanks very much, Nora. Another reminder to get your questions in for the panel. I'm sure there are loads of questions out there. Maybe I'll just kick it off with a question for Francis, and maybe Aongus, you might row in on this as well. Nora mentioned the idea of sanctions, that we need a stick as well as a carrot. Now, this proposal is not recommending specific sanctions, the EU proposal, but it does leave it up to member states. The National Women's Council of Ireland has said that companies should be fined or even denied subsidies, access to state procurement contracts if they fail to meet these targets or if they're not transparent enough in the way they hire women. Frances Fitzgerald, do you think there's appetite for that among EU member states? And maybe Aongus, you'll come in after and just say what that would mean for business.
Well, I think Nora hit the nail on the head there. I'm actually tired of, analysis of equality. I'm much more interested in the solutions now and the implementation. And I personally think that if you get a directive and you get the legislation in member states, you have the target. And I think probably what you need is what Nora said. I think you need an implementation body, an oversight body that brings those working on this area together and highlights on an ongoing basis and publishes the results of what what companies are doing, those who are being successful, those who are not. What the directive says is that they're not recommending sanctions, actually. It's saying member states can decide, by the way, but it's also saying that, we ask companies to come up front and explain why they haven't met the target. Now, that would be a very interesting discussion in Ireland when government calls people in or publicly gets an explanation as to why you haven't reached your 30, 35, 40%. I think there's very few companies who would want to, take the glare of publicity if that was the situation. So, I think myself, I'm not sure a fine would make that much difference. You're probably not in the civil justice, you're not going to go much further than that. So I think it's a whole of society approach. If there's a sanction, perhaps you could build in something if over a period of time in the legislation it has not been met, then X or Y would happen from a sanction point of view. But I think it's a whole of society kind of approach that you need with good, strong leadership on it and a body overseeing it and really calling to account. I know when I was Minister for Justice, I brought in the system of government departments, each of them reporting on the bodies, the state bodies under their control, coming to Cabinet with a report. I think it was at least every year, if not every 6 months. And I tell you, you began to see a difference when finance or environment or whatever minister had to say, well, actually, there were 10 vacancies and I appointed 2 women or 3 or whatever. That kind of monitoring and watching the targets, I think, is very important, probably more important than anything else, and doing it publicly. I think, it's a little bit naming and shaming because, you've got to say it's unacceptable now. Let's move on it.
I just add, I think that I shared some of the key stats in relation to the progress that we've seen on the boards, and I fully accept we're not at that 40% mark. But on the ISAC 20, we are at 32, I mentioned. I do believe that as we set the next set of targets, the next target aim will be to get to 40%. There is good progress. I think, whether it's quotas or whether it's targets is what's in place today. The things that companies need to do and the education that we need to continue to highlight to companies that it is a business imperative, it is a differentiation. Many of the speakers have talked about the benefits of more diverse boards and leadership teams and the benefits that brings. The actions and activities that companies still need to do, whether it is because there's a set of quotas in place or whether they're set out their targets for what they want to achieve, are the same things I mentioned earlier on. And getting companies to continue to build their action plans, to create that succession planning, and to continue to report progress. And if that progress has to be reported then publicly and clearly explained, etc., that clearly will add to the focus that we have on this. I know the conversation today is on boards. If I look at the statistics, us within the EU, within boards in Ireland, etc., there is significant progress. The area which I highlighted and I want to re-emphasize, where the greatest economic impact and benefit to society, to growth, to all of the areas we've talked about, is in leadership teams and organizations and senior leadership teams. We can't lose that, and that's why myself and Julie, over the next 2 years with the Balance for Better Business, we'll continue to drive the board element through the tracking we have, but we're going to put far more emphasis on the leadership teams. This is where the business decisions are made. This is where the real economic impact and benefit and change in culture and society that we want to achieve will come from.
Thanks, Angus. Can I pick up on that point actually? Because I think Margaret mentioned this survey out by Indeed this week about women experiencing burnout because they have, and I think Nora mentioned it too, lots of care responsibilities. The central bank reported earlier this year that we have record numbers of women in the labour force now because of the flexible working allowed during the pandemic. But on the other side of it, we have this burnout. I mean, do women actually want to be in leadership positions? Maybe Margaret and Nora, you might both come in. Margaret first.
I would say they absolutely want to be in leadership positions, but perhaps the supports that they receive at home, from work, and wider society make it more difficult than for men. If you want to join a board, you might ask yourself, as I did as well, I have two small kids and I run my own business and I'm doing this, that, and the other thing, for extended family. Do I have the time for this? And I couldn't have done it without support at home, without support from my colleagues at work and others. So I think we need to look a little bit deeper and help women get those supports, seek out those supports, provide those supports. And I think something else we need to talk about that we haven't spoken about is bullying and harassment and the way that businesses deal with that. Because sometimes as you go up the food chain and there's more competition, that can intensify. So there have been moves afoot in the last little while to change where that sits within a company to make it health and safety issue and not just a HR issue, but that it's a health and safety issue, that there's a duty of care to all of your employees that they will not be bullied or harassed or sexually abused at work. So I think that's something else that we need to think about if we do want more women in leadership. That's a real barrier that needs to be addressed.
I think I'd love to be on a panel where somebody asked men if they had enough time to sit on boards. In my own experience, women are pretty keen to get on in their workplace. They definitely want to make a contribution. They want a voice, and they certainly want a seat around that boardroom table. It's just incredibly hard to get one. Sometimes because it's through, a phone call. When I left a lot of boards after my husband died, I could almost hear the chairman saying, "I know a great guy that I went to school with, or I knew from university who could sit in that seat." So it's very, very hard without having, without having that imprimatur to say that they need to have women on their boards, that they need quotas, that they need to reach targets. It's very, very hard to break through. Like, for instance, in the last year, I've been calling out 3 or 4 manels. I haven't seen those for 5 or 6 years, and they've suddenly emerged again. Not because anybody thinks that it's great to have 6 men talking to us, but they just don't put on their gender spectacles. They don't see it. They don't see that it's better to have a balance on that panel rather than putting an all-male panel together. And I don't want to be the one that calls them out. I'd rather if there was a more effective body that nudged them and said, that's not good. I think I'm reminded too of the fact that in corporate life, when women are manifesting behaviors, they have now been researched so often. When I started Planet Woman, I was intrigued as to why all the way through my corporate life, I was seeing women who couldn't speak in meetings, especially if they're a lone woman like myself, who didn't go for salary increases, 3 times less likely, and then ask for 30% less. Definitely don't go for jobs until they're overqualified. That famous Hewlett-Packard study that's been replicated so often now, it's absolutely 100% true that men will throw their hat in the ring at 80% and women wait till they're over 100% qualified. So why do women have those behaviors? Sometimes it's to do with the corporate culture. And by the way, if you think the culture is bad at 23, you feel like you're on a different planet by the time you have a baby in some corporate cultures. But also the women themselves need support. The reason I talk about mentorship all the time is that because we're building on a foundation which was essentially made for men, we need to help women to chart a way through it, because I don't think anytime soon we're going to change the infrastructure of HR or provide disruptive policies. I'll give you one example. Is I've been giving awards to women for over 20 years. When they get up on the stage, even if they're presidents of Ireland or senior women, Frances Fitzgerald I was delighted to give an award to, and many others, they all get up on that stage and say, "It wasn't me. See that table down there full of my team? It was all of them. It was all those great great people supported me. Women work in that team collegiate way. I've certainly stood on platforms where men have taken an award and taken credit for things that weren't entirely 100% their responsibility. So no wonder women don't put themselves forward for jobs as individuals. No wonder they don't put themselves forward for awards or put themselves forward for boards. So we need to have a proactive and a different system to try and ensure they take part.
Thanks very much. Barbara and Nolan, I might bring you back in because the European Commission has also put forward other measures, is coming forward later today with some measures to criminalise to rape, to criminalise, online harassment against women. There's also moves in the pipeline on gender pay gap. Now, Ireland has its own legislation due to come in later this year when companies will have to report. But maybe can you tell me how those other legislative initiatives are important or feed in or link in with what we're talking about today? Maybe to get women, to encourage women to get to the point where they can and want to and are able to get on boards.
Well, first, I'd like to say that since President von der Leyen became President of the European Commission, there has been a huge, renewed focus on gender equality issues. And there was a new strategy developed on gender equality with very ambitious new proposals put forward for the future. And indeed, today there is a very important measure going through concerning violence against women. And I think that shows that, all these flanking measures, and of course, we've never said that this, proposal for a directive about women on boards is the panacea. We know, of course, that there are many flanking issues, and I think Aongus mentioned them, and Nora and Margaret and Frances too, the need for other flanking measures that will actually make a change, because changing culture requires other measures as well as simply putting down a directive. So indeed, the gender pay gap is one area that is being very heavily monitored. There is, a whole panoply of other measures coming forward and a renewed focus on gender equality because, as many speakers have said today, we're not where we want to be. And in some cases, we're even, with the COVID situation and how it has panned out for many women, it's actually, some would say it's a backward step. So, I think that is what's been very good is there has been a whole mobilization on gender equality issues. There is a cross services group that looks at gender equality issues from all angles in order to try to bring about real change. So, I think there are many more things coming down the tracks, I think, that will improve, hopefully, women's lives and their working lives as well.
Thanks very much, Barbara. I have one question in here from the chat. It's from Michelle O'Halloran. She's wondering, what age do you need to be to apply to stateboards.ie? Maybe that's for you, Margaret Ward.
I actually don't know if there's an age limit, and I think that's an excellent question because something else we need much younger people on boards. I am seeing more of that, thank goodness, and I think that they're often brought in for things that the older ones on the board don't understand, things like technology, which is quite amusing. I don't think there's a limit, but I don't know. I'm not on stateboards.ie or the public appoints committee. I would say maybe 18.
Thanks very much. We have to finish up relatively soon, but maybe just one more question, and it's an issue that all of you touched on, the issue of diversity. The Commission's proposal for women on boards is about the underrepresented gender, but one of the top feminists in history, I would say, Audre Lorde, talked about how there's no hierarchy of oppression. You can't separate gender from race, from class, from age, from physical ability. You all mentioned that the Irish population is growing much faster. It's much younger. The non-white Irish population is growing faster than the white Irish. Is this about is this a funding issue? How do we make sure that that everyone, all kinds of women, all kinds of men, all kinds of people are brought on board and on boards?
Well, I'll come in on that, Sarah. I think it's quite simple, really. It's about values. I mean, it's about the value of diversity. It's about the value of inclusion. I mean, that's what gender diversity is about, racial diversity. I mean, all of the other areas you've talked about, creating a disability inclusive society. So, it's a value. It's about the value the country has and how it shows those values by the work it does, by the policies that it makes, by the representation it offers. And the problem is that we have unfinished democracies. We have a long way to go in Ireland. We're one of the leaders. There's no doubt about that. The European Parliament is one of the leaders in terms of representation of women at 39% and in terms of those values. But there's no room for complacency. I mean, we need consistently to look at all of these issues through the gender lens. And actually, for about 10 years there, you couldn't even talk about feminism. But now we've seen the change, and we see how the value is more widely changed. But make no mistake, I know it from being at the top of Irish politics, we have a long way to go. And let me just very quickly say that the care issue is absolutely fundamental. Until we start valuing care, the carers, who does the care, combining work and family life, it's going to be incredibly difficult to deal with all of those issues. And care is so low down the agenda because it's been primarily done by women. There is a new care strategy coming out from the Commission again next week. I asked next year, actually the end of this year, I asked Ursula von der Leyen to put that in her State of the Union speech, and she did. And that's very exciting because we could get new initiatives right across Europe on that. All of these things come together, I think, in terms of representation. You tackle some of these fundamental issues, then you begin to get the inclusiveness and diversity that you need.
Yeah. I just think when it comes to diversity, we're woefully inadequate. If you look across the board so let's leave the ISEC boards to one side and the targets and what we might achieve there. In fact, the bodies who monitor those boards are woefully inadequate in terms of diversity. And I talk about diversity, obviously in terms of race and culture, women and men, but also different walks of life, not the same type of people that have the same backgrounds, and different age groups. You had a great question there about the age in which you could, apply for a state board. I'm pretty sure, like Margaret, that it's 18, but we need more young voices. I'm obsessed with looking at the first generation of women who managed to elbow their way into boardrooms. How did they do it without the legislation, without the support that we got as second or third generation women founders and women on boards? But we need to listen to the next generation because they don't have the same hang-ups as us. So wisdom doesn't always come with age, but we definitely need to address diversity in government-appointed bodies more than anything else.
Rachel, if I could just add one other point I would say, Sarah, is skills and access to talent is going to be a huge stimulus for business in ensuring that they're taking a much wider lens here in hiring and bringing talent on board. We've set metrics in our own company where 30% of all the people we hire come with no experience, because we want to bring young people in with innovative ideas and thinking and approach and build a pipeline of talent for the future. Across all of these areas, race, class, ability, etc., companies have to look at that. And I'm not just talking about technical skills. All skills in the marketplace here in Ireland and across Europe requires businesses to ensure they're taking that wider lens to bring the talent into their organization. And when they do that, they'll get all the benefits of the diversity and with an inclusive culture that comes with what we talked about from a business perspective as well too.
Before we wrap up, I just have, sorry, Margaret, you want to come in?
Sorry, I just want to just pick up on what Frances said about an unfinished democracy. I think what we forget is that the proclamation was one of the first documents in the world that promised equality between men and women. And I think it would be great if we had a new proclamation where we're saying that who we see at the top is representative of Ireland as it is today. That is the big work of our unfinished democracy.
It's true.
Thanks very much to everybody. I think we have to wrap up. We've already gone a few minutes over. Catherine Morgan, your question has been seen. I will put it to the panel myself, and hopefully we might get back to you in some sense after this. But it just remains for me to thank everybody, to thank the Parliament and the Commission for co-organising this. Thank you to Barbara Nolan, to Frances Fitzgerald, Aongus Hegarty, Margaret E Ward and Nora Casey for their time and their insight. Keep an eye out later today for the European Commission's announcement on violence against women, and the Employment Council next week for potential progress on the Women on Boards initiative. Thanks to everybody.